I mean, there's so much to be grateful, one of them being all the women that paved the path before me, because it made it pretty easy to be in here now, and pretty darn enjoyable at that. I'm going to piggyback off of Krista when she started asking questions and had y'all raise your hand. I want to get a little bit of pulse about the room. So who here is involved in the daily operations of their farm, of a farm? Okay. Who here works off of the farm, but in agriculture? Okay. Who here follows commodity prices? Who here has heard the saying, women are better grain marketers? I don't know if I fall in that category or not. They have me stand up here and talk. Who here is confused about the markets, especially in this current environment? And to all who didn't raise their hand, you get up here, because I'm really confused about what's going on too, right? To put it simply, I mean, part of the thing that I want to do here today is talk about the 3 different things that are really affecting things right now. I mean, there's a gamut of different stuff that impacts markets, right? But I'm trying to make it simple, okay? And the way that I want to keep it simple actually comes back through from a story about my 7-year-old son when he was 3-year-old. I've got a 7-year-old son, soon to be 4-year-old daughter. She's a little spitfire, and middle child maybe the issues are there, and then a newly 5-month-old baby girl as well. So our house can be a bit chaotic at times, especially since my husband farms and I work from home. So needless to say, it takes a village, and we're very, very thankful for our village as well. The other thing that I didn't foresee as being a benefit, or even, I wasn't even on my radar, but when I've been working from home my entire career, and then I go out and I visit with the producers and their families about their operations at their kitchen table. And so one of the great things about that is when I'm home, and my kids are home at the same time, and we're farming and we're doing all these things, they get to see us work, and they get to work with us. And what a gift that is. And I think it's especially special, for lack of a better term, to the ag industry. And it's just neat because that breeds that work ethic into them, breeds the love for agriculture and everything within that. So one of the days when my son was at home and I had just gotten off the phone with a client, and he comes running into the office and like he's gonna have this huge epiphany. He's like, "Mommy!" I mean, he was 3 years old at the time, and he says, "Mommy, the markets go up and the markets go down." And I'm like, holy smokes, he's a genius! Our kid's a genius! I don't know where he got it, but he's a genius, right? Honey, stop all retirement savings. We've got our kid. He's going to take care of us. We'll be fine, right? All joking aside, I mean, that's a very simple way to put it. If somebody ever asks about the markets, well, they go up and they go down. And boy, haven't they been doing that lately. So my goal here today is just to talk not necessarily about where I see them, if it's up or down, because at the end of the day, nobody knows where the markets are going. If they tell you they do and they're trying to sell you a product, run as fast as you can, because they're not telling the truth, because nobody has that crystal ball that works. The bigger thing about it is, what are the risks and the opportunities in the market, and how does it impact you? In whatever job application you're in, whether you're the wife at home marketing the grain, or you're the person in the business setting trying to buy that said corn, or trying to understand how it impacts your farmer's purchasing decision, whatever it may be, there's an array of different impacts for different people. But whatever that may be, just understand how they kind of fluctuate. Okay? And so that's what I'm hoping to get into here. We're going to take a very fundamental look at it, right? There's the fundamental side, supply and demand, and then there's the technical side, which is all those crazy charts that everybody looks at, right? I won't get into that because that gets really confusing, and quite frankly, you just ate and you're eating some more, and I don't want you to fall asleep on me, okay? So those 3 things, right? War, huge one. Weather, huge conversation every year, but even more so this year, and we'll get into why. And the world, right? Specifically that inflation, recession conversation that we're having as we sit today, okay? So who are we? We're Ever.ag. Probably a name not a lot of you are associated with. It's a new name coming from a lot of different businesses that have been in this industry for a long time. Basically, through the last few years, we've combined forces because we see this huge need in the industry to sit there and help you manage your risk, but actually understanding where you sit in the meantime, right? And through technology and how those supply chains come throughout the whole marketplace is important. So we deal with producers, we deal with commercial buyers, and we deal with everybody in between, okay? Through a lot of different avenues. My specific job is highly catered toward the grain producer and helping him market his grain and manage his risk. Okay? And helping him execute whatever plan we put forward based off of whatever his needs actually are. Okay? So enough about us, now onto the markets. Okay? World inflation, holy smokes, is this topic of conversation for not just people in agriculture, but everybody. Because we're all sitting there going, how are we gonna pay for this gas? I've got kind of a gas guzzler, I'm one of those naughty people, but I've got a big family, and we've got lots of stuff that we have to carry around with us, and it's about needed to take a loan sometimes to get it filled up. Especially when it taps out because you've hit your dollar limit before the vehicle's actually full yet too, which is, ugh. Anywho, it's no surprise to anybody, gasoline prices are high. Thankfully, I mean, we started the beginning of the year and they were already a lot higher than what we had been used to the past few years. But what happened during that time frame? Anybody? The Ukraine. Yep, exactly. All of a sudden it was, where's our oil going to come from? Oh no, right? And it put this huge panic into everybody. We've been on this climb hill higher. Thankfully, we've seen a little bit of decline. But I think one of the questions is it because we have enough supply, or is there something else going on too? We see that spending going through the roof, right? $125 a week spent on gas alone is the average household spending on gas. Ouch! I would beg to think mine is a little bit higher than that. But, I mean, that ranges for everybody from working at home to driving all the time, right? That's the average. Essentially, inflation is running amok. It is insane what that price index is for the consumer. Why does this matter? Because inflation means greater dollars, less volume. So people are sitting, they have to sit there and look at how much product they are buying, especially when they're looking at their personal budgets. How is that impact being felt? I'm gonna continue to be a majority on this side just because that's where we're all at, but every now and then I'm not ignoring you, I promise. So when we sit there and we look at personal expenditures are higher, but look at the inflation adjusted compensation curve, which then correlates into that U.S. personal savings. Take a heavy look at that and just let that sink in. And I know I said I'd talk about grain markets for the most part, but part of the reason why I'm spending a decent amount of time on this is who is our number 1 and 2 users of corn? Ethanol and feed, 100%. Okay? And so when we have consumers that are not amused, the lowest consumer sentiment that we've had since they started studying it, we see people cut back. On what? They stop eating out as much, and they start buying less meat. Uh-oh, how do we go to eat out? Most everybody doesn't walk or ride their bike to go eat out, especially if you live 20 miles from town, right? You're gonna get in your vehicle, you're gonna drive there, and if you're eating less meat, so ethanol right there, right? And if you're eating less meat, the demand for that meat becomes less. So it's one of those things that affects the grain markets because it affects ethanol and feed so drastically. Okay? So that's why we're keeping a close eye on that. Not only for our livestock and our dairy producers, but also for our grain producers. And how are they managing what that demand destruction looks like? Okay? The other part that we're also looking at, that evil R word, okay? The technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters with a shrinking GDP, growing gross domestic product, right? So do I think that it's gonna be like the bubble that just popped, right? No, I don't think it's gonna be like that, particularly because of what that job demand still looks like, but it's still something we wanna keep our eye on, because when people hear that recession word, we get scared and we batten down the hatches even more, okay? So as we take a look into that, we haven't noticed the huge changes yet, the huge shift or anything like that. We're starting to become concerned as to what this fall brings us. Because right now, I'm just as guilty, or not even guilty from that standpoint, but I'm in the camp too of wanting to enjoy my summer with my family. We've had 2 summers that have been kind of blah, right, because of COVID, right? And so now we're trying to get out there and enjoy it, right? And have our children understand what a normal summer is, for that matter. And so as people get back into school, back into the normal work grind, and quite frankly, opening up that credit card bill, ouch. Honey, it's time to batten down the hatches, right? And so that's why we're concerned about the fall, okay? So something to keep in mind. Better question, and I've alluded to it a little bit, is how does this affect grains? What I want to do though first is go back in time, into the good old 2020. One of those times that just really sends shivers up my spine, right? Particularly at the beginning of COVID, because we hadn't shut down yet, but boy were we watching what everything was going on, because as that ethanol demand dropped off, so did the price of grains, and boom, we were limit down, and it's like, how much farther can it go? And it started to bottom out in that, well, at first we saw it bottom out in 350, right? And we started talking about what that balance sheet looked like. And 3 billion bushels of corn we're gonna have. Normally we're hoping to get 2 billion bushels of corn. That's the standard. And here we're gonna have this pile of corn because nobody's using it, the crop went in great, it's all looking good, so on and so forth. So we start to get some weather concerns, we see a little bit of a bump in there, and then it just starts going back down. Who here is from Eastern Iowa? Hello, friend.
No.
Oh, 2. 2 people. Well, now 3, right? I'm with you on that. What happened in August of 2020?
Rain.
Derecho.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it rained with the derecho. That helped our beans out, but it rained. And it blew really, really hard. And it wiped out the crop. And
Here too.
yeah, it kind of did start here, didn't it?
Oh, yes. We had 100 mile winds here.
You know, and so when you think about that, I mean, it started around here. Yeah, it was a little bit out in that western Iowa, but it really started to take off through this area, and it went all the way into central Illinois. That is a lot of acres that got impacted in a really ugly way. Our farm, our own farm, we zeroed out every single corn acre. It was heartbreaking to do, but at the time we thought that was the best thing to do. And so, boom, we shot down supply. What else happened in August of 2020? If you're from western Iowa, I think there was a supply story going on too. Was there hail in there? Yep, kind of devastating hail from that standpoint. So supply, what else was going on in that fall time frame, we'll call it? Maybe a little bit more demand driven. No takers? Who likes to shop? Don't be shy. Don't be shy. I may pick on you, but don't be shy. So I'm going to pick on you because I don't. I hate shopping. You go in for one thing and you just can't ever find it, and you end up coming back with 50 other things. Thank you, Target. Right? So instead, I like to sit there in my sweatpants on my couch with my computer and a glass of wine in hand and just buy all my needs there. Right? Specifically around Black Friday shopping and all that. Well, I'm the complete opposite from my mother-in-law. She loves to shop. I mean, every deal she's there, she's telling us about it. It's kind of comical from that standpoint. And basically, China came in and sat there and said, "Your corn's on sale. We haven't seen $3 corn in a really long time." And they basically acted like my mother-in-law on Black Friday and came in and bought it all. We're buying all the corn, all of it. Just give it to us. We'll take it all. Part of that is because they were just coming out of this African swine fever thing, right? Where they're getting their hog herd built back up. They had depleted all their stocks before, so now they're like, oh yeah, I could use some more to sit on. But really it was more, it's on sale, this is great. And the other part of it was they also saw, they had an inkling as to what was going to happen. The same inkling that the funds had, right? The managed money funds, right? The speculators or whatever you want to call them, okay? And it basically alluded to this. So, when the government came in, I think it was around summertime, and they started having all these stimulus dollars being piled on, right? Floods and floods of money coming into the U.S. economy to help sustain what we had going, right? To help businesses and everybody just try to even out from that standpoint. What happens when so many dollars are put into the economy? It gets spent because it's the patriotic thing to do, right? Or at least so I'm told, right? Same thing kind of happened back in 2008. That's not on this chart. We had the cash for clunkers and all that kind of stuff come into play, and things took off. Why does money hitting our economy make the corn market go higher? Because when you're a buyer of goods, and you're afraid that all this money is coming in and people are going to spend said money, we're afraid of the price going higher. And so the way that you hedge against inflation, the way that you hedge against the cost of goods rising is to buy said goods, right? So the funds stepped in along with China and they bought. And they bought, and they bought, and they bought. Not only on corn, they bought it on beans, cotton, rice, you name it, they bought it. And the market just went through the roof, right? We had newfound demand. Typically, demand isn't built overnight like China did with us, right? It's one of those things that it takes some time to have a cow or to have a calf, to then have the feed that is needed for them, or it takes time to build that ethanol plant or that soybean crush facility, or you name it, right? Demand is typically, they call it very elastic, right? It's that long climb higher. Right? It's usually supply that makes us do this. And we had a little bit of the supply story going, but we also had that newfound demand and then the buyers hitting this market, okay? So when we sit here in the terms of inflation conversation, when we sit here and talk about the funds that bought in on all this inflation, ooh, it was back then. But now the question is, what are they going to do with those positions, those bought positions of theirs? Especially if they start to have concerns around the economy and the recession and what that inflation looks like as the funds are starting to, as the feds are starting to raise interest rates. Those are all pieces of that conversation that at a first glance you say, oh, commodities aren't associated to that. Bet you bottom dollar they are in a big, big way. Because as you can see, they can make the market move quite a bit. Okay? So as we go into that, we'll start talking more about where we see them go or what we anticipate their thought process around that may be. But a lot of that then has the conversation around war and weather as well. Those are all still things that they're watching too. Okay? So let's talk about war. Another thing that sends shivers up my spine is this whole Russia-Ukraine conversation. More so on a personal level. I mentioned that I had a 5-month-old daughter, and the day that my doc said, hey, it's time to induce you, was the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. Don't worry, Doc. I think Russia's got it taken care of. I don't need an induction, right? Just the sheer stress of everything that was going on, I thought was going to do it anyways, right? Because the markets were limit up, then they were limit down, and at the end of the day, we had no idea where we were supposed to be on all of it. Physical buyers were sitting there and saying, Ukraine is the number 4 exporter of grain. And in a time frame that we're already tight on stocks compared to what we use, where's that grain going to come from? I don't know, right? And so the spread between May and July just went kitty on this, and it was crazy, right? And the market started taking off. Gas wasn't the only thing that we saw take off even more, right? So as we evaluate what's going on, we're really curious as to how those exportable supplies are going to be fed into the market. Something that we're already starting to peel the onion layers back on, right? At first, Turkey and Russia and Ukraine, they made their trade agreement, and they sat there and said, we'll allow grain to be exported so long as you don't try to smuggle things in, right? But we're not going to demine the seas. Anybody want to insure that? Load of grain? I don't. But, so that was my first thought process when they said that a trade agreement was made. But as I really started to think about that, the other part of that is these third world countries are starving for grain. They are so food insecure that they don't care if it's insured. They just want the food, right? So that's something, and so they made the trade agreement, right? 24 hours later, they come back and Russia bombs the port. Thank you. We'll believe you with everything, it's this whole conversation around watch their actions, not their words. Okay? And so as we were watching their actions, it got a little scary again. And thankfully, we had the weekend to digest it. They claimed that it was targeted at a specific ship that was heading inbound. It only hit one grain silo, so everything else is pretty good. You can still export out. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. And for a while, when that happened, the market started to take off, not believing them and their story. But here recently, we had a ship go out of that port, right? And they're expected to have a ship a day. Now, what does that mean? We'll come back to this, I promise. But while I'm on this tangent, we're going to go through that. What does that mean? Okay, a shipment is a shipment can basically, it depends on the size of the ship. Okay, and if we have one per day, that can range anywhere from 1.5 million metric tons that are shipped out by the end of year end, or up to 61 million tons. Well, their anticipated corn exports is 33 million metric tons. And left to ship for the year is 14 to 15 million metric tons. Okay? So we can actually meet that objective. That's looking hopeful. That's a good thing for the world. Maybe not for your grain prices, but for the world it is, right? Now the next question is, what are they going to be producing? Right? On this crop year, what are they going to have to be able to feed the world later on? Nobody knows the answer to that question yet. The people that are typically associated with announcing that to the rest of the world, they're kind of a little busy right now. And I don't even know if they have the true picture of how many hectares actually got planted, right? And what's that production looking like? And is the farmer going to be busy defending his own land? Because, so when you sit there and you've got the equivalent of the Corn Belt, and they have really high productive land, mind you, okay? When you have that picture across the U.S., this is basically Ukraine, okay? So when we sit there, this is their highly productive areas, and maybe the fringe areas, so to speak. Now look at where they're getting attacked at, right? In their home front, right? And they're penetrating forward into that. And so that's a huge concern that we have. Maybe it's in the ground.
Are they able to get their inputs?
For the most part, I believe they already had them bought. But, just like we, for the most part, had our inputs bought as well. But again, the news, the news is so hit and miss on that because they're busy reporting on everything else that's going on as well.
Actually, that would be good.
There was planting going on. That's all I can say. We can come to a settlement at some point. Little side note, so that place where they're shipping out of is right in that Odessa port. Okay, so you can see basically why they chose that area, and I guess they're defending back against that port and making some headway as well. We'll see how it goes from there. But then there's the conversation of a different port. more potential for it, right? This is something, I mean, as the Ukraine and Russian tensions were rising before they actually invaded, this was also something that the tensions were rising back then too. And it's been on our radar specifically because we talked about what the number 1 and 2 users of corn are. Who's the number 1 buyer of soybeans? China, right? And if they don't like our policies, or we don't like theirs, one of the easiest and non-violent ways to do something about it is to limit exports, right? So that's something that we're really keeping a close eye on. They're started to talk about how China is pointing missiles towards that Taiwan Strait, right? And they're also talking about how they're sounding sirens all around. Is that them flexing their muscles just to show how big and bad they are? Or is their bark as loud as their bite? I don't know. Stay tuned, right? Something to really keep an eye on, because while one war can be super bullish for our markets, one more can be super bearish. Okay, so please keep a close eye on that. Angie Treptow touched on this a little bit. And while we're on the conversation of politics, I wanted to touch on it too. And that's the renewable fuel side of things. Because it's another thing that from a bean perspective could be the thing that counterbalances stuff a little bit, right? Who has heard much about that renewable diesel? Awesome. So you may, and you guys are obviously smarter than me, especially around a lot of this stuff, so you may know more than me about it already. From what I understand, that the stuff that's made on that side of things is a one-to-one comparison chemically to what diesel fuel is. So they can basically put it in their trucks and away they go, right? And they're looking to do the same thing with jet fuel, maybe blend it a little bit, right? Versus your ethanol's a blend, and a lot would argue that it's not as good of a blend. You don't get as great as fuel mileage and different stuff like that. This could be a huge opportunity for the soybean market. Huge opportunity. Especially when you sit there, I mean, it talks about it's made from vegetable oils. And a majority of the vegetable oils consist of that soybean oil. That's why we talk so heavily about the soybean side of it, right? And we're starting to see it a little bit already, the speculation as to how that'll work in the market. Because typically on soybeans, especially in the domestic standpoint, when we process a bean, we process it, you get 2 products once you process it, right? You get the meal and the oil. And the sole source for beans right now being processed is meal. And then the oil is just the byproduct that we have to figure out what we want to do with it. That started to change after COVID, specifically because of Indonesia and some of these Malaysian palm oil markets that were going on. And the shortage of that, soybean oil can be an offset of that or another derivative of it. So that market already started to run higher, but this renewable fuel source has been definitely one of the leading things from that. So the White House obviously has an initiative around it. And the story is that we're going to need 30 million extra acres to meet that demand from their initiative. That's a lot. I mean, we're shrinking in acres, not growing. Where are we going to come up with this? Right? We've pretty well maxed out everywhere we're going to farm. How's that going to look? How are we going to meet that? Well, we'll get into that a little bit, but first we got to overcome the objective of the politics, right? And we've started to do that a little bit. On Friday, they announced the $1 tax credit, $1 per gallon tax credit to the producers of this product. But there's still a long way to go in the balancing back and forth, and what do we want to fund, and well, what does that do to the next industry, and who do we really want to put our resources towards? Looking like this, but and we're seeing the market respond to it. Anybody live up by Shell Rock? Yeah. Huge opportunity in your back of the woods.
We're looking forward to another marketing.
100% versus Cargill, Cedar Rapids, and Cargill, Iowa Falls, right?
Definitely.
And I'd much rather deliver to a brand new facility than a 50-year-old facility
And we've
too.
got AGP at Mason.
Absolutely, it's great. It's a huge opportunity. And we're seeing more and more of them pop up, right? This one that where Mid-Iowa Co-op and Phillips 66 partnered together is the one that we're referring to in Shell Rock, and there's a lot more of them coming on. And what's really neat about this market, this oil market, is you can sit there, I mean, all these plants that used to process that crude oil, right, and those type of oils can basically flip the switch and use it for this purpose. So when we talked about demand is typically that slow grind higher, well, this might be a little bit better from that standpoint because we already have current processing facilities and we can flip a switch and boom, we can keep on going, right? And then while we can continue to build and build and build. So big opportunities ahead of us. So the question is, back to that 30 million acre increase, what are the long-term implications?
Well, and what do we do with all that meal?
Yeah,
We don't have enough animals to eat all that meal.
100%. You got this down.
We had a webinar, it was really interesting to learn about.
Yeah, no doubt. So what I anticipate is we typically ship out all our beans as a whole when we start to export that meal,
Have to.
rather than the whole bean.
Yeah.
And I went to Ag Biz, I have a lot of econ classes, but I'm no economist by any means. So I don't know, but it almost seems like half of that acre could be made up in just our demand structure change, right? If we start shipping out the meal rather than the whole bean, then that demand really takes a flip on there, right? The other part of that other half, or whatever it may be, is if we've got our government that is really pushing this diesel initiative and the electrical car, where's the demand for ethanol? And so we start to see the acre flip from corn to beans in a big way.
Especially with the cost of inputs.
100%. Yeah. Now, I've got some folks down in Tennessee that they grow beans on beans, but there's not many people in Iowa that like growing beans, let alone beans on beans. So I guess it's all, research and development. I know we've got some Corteva scientists in the room right now, and there was a lot in here before. Thankfully, they're leading the charge and figuring out what can we do with this disease pressure? How can we help our hybrids really start to produce and meet this demand that we have? Stay tuned.
That means for all of the highly erodible land that we grow corn on because it's too steep for beans.
Sure, yeah. And maybe that's the stuff that stays corn, and some of the other good producing stuff flips over. I'm not sure. I hope that there's that, the hard part about markets is they get really erratic before they find their balance. And you're gonna see that in the coming years, right? That volatility is gonna be ever present in that.
Because really Shell Rock's the only one that's close to production. The other one in Iowa just
From-
broke ground.
Yes, correct.
And everybody else is still just kind of.
Yeah, they're
Thinking
waiting to
about it.
see how all of this policy is gonna form, but, so,
Yeah.
That's had some stuff, but
Yeah.
it's not.
The new ones.
Yeah, it's not up for doing.
so they're the only ones that are coming on new, but they're not the only processing plants in the areas, right? So we can already start to shift that mindset towards producing the oil rather than the meal, right? Not that you're gonna get more out of it because that's where the focus is, but we can still sit there and process. And it's just a matter of does these max capacities start to change and we really start to grind through it, right?
So they figured out what the break even or what they have to have for diesel in order to be able to pay for the soybeans. At what point do the soybeans price themselves out of
That
the
is
market?
a great question. And that's why the cure to high prices is always has high prices, right? Because it still destroys demand in the meantime. And part of that tax bill that came out also allowed a 10-year extension on all of these supply chains for that oil, right? So they're trying to do the more balanced approach, and yeah, we are gonna fund this, and we really want to see that going, but we realize that we can't flip the switch and have it all at once. So here's the other side of it.
That was one thing, ethanol, when the gas prices got so low, then the ethanol didn't want to produce because it wasn't, they were losing the money on it.
Yep, and we'll get to ethanol margins here pretty soon because it's going to be the same conversation, and things that we're going to have a close eye on is what is those crush facilities margins look like, versus demand, right? Okay, and so we'll come back to that piece of it, I promise. The third W, so to speak, is that weather, which has been a hot one here lately. I'm cold in here, but boy, you step out and it's like, oh, get this off, this is hot, right? So before we go there, right, I talked about when Russia invaded Ukraine. I just had a baby, I was going on maternity leave, and it was awesome because it just kept on raining, right? And so mom and baby got to snuggle in and take naps and not feel real bad about it, right? Especially for somebody that's sleep deprived. But my husband, who was also sleep deprived, was real angry because it kept on raining and he wanted to get into the field to plant the corn and the beans, right? And so I was like, what are you talking about? This is great. And he's like, no, I need to get this stuff planted. Well, he did, and so did everybody else, in about a 3-week time frame. That's impressive. Darn impressive when you have 60% of a crop that gets planted in 3 weeks. Like truly, it's just amazing what you guys are able to do. So, thankfully you did, because there is very little room for error. From a balance sheet perspective, we are on our second lowest stocks to use ratio since 2013. Basically since the last time we were at prices like this. Something to keep in mind, right? Especially as we start to talk about yields. From a world standpoint, I mean, we're on the higher end of the stocks, partially due to Ukraine not being able to ship out their stuff. You're sitting on stocks, right? But at the end of the day, we still need to figure out where that's all coming from and how we're going to be able to meet that usage demand. Okay? The other side of that, as I alluded to, are those yields. Conditions are declining. How many are in one of the dry spots, right? When you look at that when you look at the drought monitor, are you on the map? The yellow, maybe red, or a dark brown type of color? We're seeing it. We're seeing it in the government's rating of our corn and bean crop. We're below that 5-year average, but yet when you sit there and look at our balance sheets, they're calling for another high yield with corn and beans. Will that come through? I don't know. Next Friday's the day to watch the grain markets, right? Because that's where they will adjust they can adjust how many acres get planted, and they can adjust the projected yield all over again. And they can adjust demand, and they can do all these different things. That's where those reports come out, and there's usually quite a bit of volatility on days like that. And especially in years like now, where we're only sitting on 1.4 billion bushels of corn and 250 some million bushels of beans. Those aren't, in the relative scheme of things, those aren't big numbers to be sitting on, right? So how will that come into play? I told you I'd talk about ethanol margins. And I wanted to throw this in here. We just got a new release of this data. Who experienced really good basis levels back in the fall? Like fall glut. Oh yeah, still are, right? But in the fall, we were experiencing maybe option at the processor, sometimes positive basis levels, and it wasn't because we didn't have a crop at all, right? It was because their margins were huge, and they're saying, bring it to me, I want to process it because I can actually make money. And right now, the basis is still super strong, but I would argue it's because we're on short supplies trying to bridge this gap between old crop and new crop, right?
Everybody thinks they're gonna get $10 corn yet.
Oh yeah, if you haven't sold out by now, you're not going to, right? You're gonna wait for that $10 and maybe sell it for $4. I don't know, I'm just kidding. But it's always hard to tell at that point, but we know that there is gonna be that gap in between. And this is just a side note for those that are selling cash and have some little stuff to get rid of. Bear in mind, when they're at levels like these, they are not afraid to take extended maintenance between old crop and new crop. So what does that mean? If you've got old crop in the bin, get it gone. If you're bullish, buy a call on what you just sold. Because I'd hate for you to have this crop, maybe it's huge because we haven't been out to the fields yet to truly understand what the size looks like. I'd hate for you to get to fall and still have old crop and then you go, where do I put the new crop? Because you couldn't get rid of it because the ethanol plants were shut down, right? We've seen it a little bit. Our Cedar Rapids, ADM Cedar Rapids is a market that the world watches for that matter, and they're cutting back on hours and everything. And there's this misconception of gas prices are high, so therefore they should make money. Why are they closed so much? Because they're not making it much right now, right? So just bear that in the back of your mind, especially when we talk, once again, about the cure to high prices is high prices. This is called demand destruction. And we want to make sure we keep a close eye on that. But back to the weather conversation. We talked about who's in the drought monitor. There's pieces of Iowa that are pretty darn dry. Now, we've seen some relieving rains here recently. Is it too little too late for corn, especially depending on what your pollination period looked like? Or is it the $1 million, maybe $1 billion rain that we were all hoping for because we had kernel fill and beans are made in the month of August and we really want to see a good crop out of this? All the questions that we have going forward. What's really interesting is this western half of the United States, right? This is actually a huge improvement compared to last year. Huge improvement for the western part of the states. It's actually really, really good to see. The hard part is about this is they came off of a year that was devastating last year, so they were low on feed the way it was. Because out here, you're heavy in your livestock, right? Your dairy, your cattle, all of that is super heavy out there. And they were going through a lot of the hay buildup that they had already had. And this year they're at a point where we've got guys down in Texas and physical buyers that we work with, and they're like, we can't buy anything. We said, name your price, and we can't get anything bought, let alone shipped to us. So what do you do instead? Sell the cows. Sell the cows, because you can't feed them. That's what we can do, right? I had guys up in Montana that were calling me, hey, do you want to buy any of my cows? I'd really hate to just kill them for nothing, right? I'd like to, they're good cows. Sorry, Rachel wiped out all my pasture fence, right? I'd love to, but I can't. I don't have a barn, I don't have pasture or anything like that, right? The logistical issues of everything have been an absolute nightmare. And what's sad specifically for the Texas people is when we sit here and look at the rain that has come across, right? Some of the devastating rains like Kentucky has seen and whatnot. I've been teasing my coworker because he lives in Texas. I'm like, you holding up an umbrella over the state of Texas? I know it's big, but I mean, it's like they completely missed that area from a rainfall standpoint. So stay tuned. Their corn crop was nothing, right?
Do you think they're gonna run out of water in like the California area because of Lake Mead being gone?
I mean, run out, I don't know before people, I mean, we've got a lot of dairy clients in that California area, and the amount of people that are moving to Idaho and South Dakota and those type of places is heavy because of the water issue, you know, not just because of politics and policy, but mainly because of that water issue, right? They want to keep their family business that they've built into this empire going, but they can't unless they move, right? So it's all complex that's super interesting to watch from that standpoint. So going forward, we talked about how kernel fill and beans are made into August. Here's the current forecast for the next 8 to 14 days. What's really interesting to me, I mean, we're supposed to be warm, right? Make sure air conditioners work, clean them out, all that kind of stuff. Maybe the boat works, all that kind of stuff. But what's more so interesting to me is the area that really isn't that parched for water in a relative term is also the area that's going to be a little bit drier. The rest of it is supposed to be normal from a precipitation standpoint. So is there the relief at night from a temperature standpoint, and do we get enough rain to put us through? Hopefully this really comes into play for that western United States. So weather is fickle, right? We closed on Friday, and we were supposed to have 100-degree weather on Wednesday and 0 chances of rain. That didn't happen. I mean, yeah, it's hot out there, but it certainly didn't do what they said it was going to. So just as nobody can predict the markets, nobody can predict the weather. Stay tuned, right? But because of all the things that we've talked about, right? That inflation, the Fed fighting inflation, the fear of recession, a strong pollination period, we've seen the funds just completely liquidate their position. They went from one of the biggest long positions, and when I say long, I mean they bought corn, they bought beans, and they were holding this spot position. They went from one of the biggest positions they've had like that to a net neutral, or only long 100,000 contracts. In the grand scheme of things, that's a lot of corn that they sold. And at the time, the farmer was expecting, feeling a little bit more comfortable on the crop that he was having. So he was encouraged to maybe start selling a little bit of new crop, right? And the physical buyers, we talked to quite a few of those physical buyers. And during this time frame, right, we usually do a summer tour and talk with them all. They're like, we're so hand to mouth right now, we haven't really thought about new crop at all. So they're like, I think the producer is about 20% sold, which is about half of what he is typically this time of year. Okay, which is sad, right? When you look at the prices that we have, take advantage of them, even the current prices that we have, right? But they have 20% of the crop bought, and they're not quite sure what that true position looks like for their fall needs. So when you sit there and think about it, from the funds massively selling, there was no physical buyers that were coming in underneath to sit there and say, that's a good buy. They finally did right about here, right? For an array of different reasons, part of what we've already talked about. But there's an old saying that the markets eat like birds on the way up and crap like elephants on the way down. It did that, particularly because the funds took a really big crap, right? And the markets affected that in a big, big way. So it's a normal seasonal time frame. Do I see us completely falling out of bed from here? No, unless things drastically change on top of that, right? The wars worsen, specifically the Chinese and Taiwan war worsens, our recession does end up popping like a balloon rather than that slow leak. There's a lot of things that could drastically change from right now. If not, if it all just kind of trudges on like we're at right now, I would expect maybe we have this 580 type floor up to 650 type ceiling. I can't, for at this point, see a reason for a big takeoff market, right? To have that $10 corn like some guys are waiting for. I get, they're still bullish because of Ukraine and the weather and whatnot, but this market is finding its equilibrium as we sit right now. Does that change going into next year? Absolutely. What's South America plant for acres, right? They're really interesting in all the acres that they're adding, right? We're subtracting our acres every year. They're adding to their acres every year. And it's not through deforestation, right? Actually, it's a lot of these pasture grounds that are getting switched to crop grounds, which can be done really cost efficiently and time efficiently. So next year, they're projected to plant 5% more in acres than they did this year. And even if the Ukraine and Russia war is going on, most of them don't care about world politics like we do, and so they'll buy the fertilizer from them to get it planted and get the inputs on. So keep that in the back of your mind going forward. Maybe they start to have dry weather all over again, right? Who knows from a South American standpoint? But I don't think we're out of the woods yet from a supply issue standpoint. But I do have quite a few concerns around demand at this point too. So all that to say, we have opportunity. We still have opportunity. And if you're a producer of grain that is looking to market, I want to encourage you so heavily to take a heavy look at where your cost of productions are and look at the margin that you still have. That word margin is getting thrown around a lot this year, or this conference, but it's so important. I've been in this specific work for quite some time, but also with this company, but for a longer amount of time in this industry. And this is the first time at this point in time in the year that I've been able to talk to a producer about placing one more target to sit there and cover all of his expenses that he had for the year. That's huge. If you can sit there going through or going into harvest, not even be up to your crop insurance or your marketable guarantee, and have all your expenses covered where everything else is pure profit at levels like these, that is amazing. Normally it takes a guy to get to that 85 to 95% sold before he's actually in the pure profit category. Take advantage of it, please, right? And the key to that, also, when we start talking margins, we're also looking out into next year because of those rising input costs. And we know the cure to high prices is high prices, and it's usually commodities that fall first and inputs that fall second, right? So as we evaluate that, one of my biggest focuses there is to sharpen your pencils, especially in 2023. Right? Take a hard look as to what it costs you to produce, and as you're booking those inputs, call your grain marketer and get it booked on the other end too to cover that sale, because then that's margin, and the rest of it is covered from there. There's ways to manage the risk, the upside and the downside on everything else. So make sure you're paying real close attention to it, so you're not you're not throwing away all the cash that you earned this year and last year to spend on it for next year, because next year was hard. Manage it. Okay? I'm going to end with this, mainly because this is what I'm so passionate in helping guys with, and what one of our key focuses is. Anybody know Seth or heard of Seth Godin? I love his blogs, love them. And basically and then what happens? I read this a while ago, and we're not very good at predicting the future, kind of a thing that we've talked about during this presentation. We're very good at being aware of the urgency of the moment and familiar with our need to deal with emergencies. Before we react, though, it might be worth asking, and then what happens 5 times? 5 steps from here to there. If any of the steps involve, and then a miracle happens, or we'll deal with that later, or the government will help bail me out, right, with one of the programs, or it might be worth taking a few more moments to reconsider the first step. And so basically it's my mission while I'm working with producers to help walk through each of those thought processes with them. From sitting down at the beginning of the year and developing what that marketing plan looks like to the very end of that, and helping them deliver those contracts and settle them up. And then what happens? And how do we move forward if that's the case? So with that, any questions?
Yeah, you guys was pausing